For more than 4 years, Ukraine has been asking its allies for weapons to help repel Russia's invasion. Now, Kyiv says it's ready to become an arms exporter. The Ukrainian government's approved a new mechanism for selling weapons and military technology abroad, particularly drones and counter-drone systems developed under fire. Officials say the needs of Ukraine's army will still come first, but the move could turn the country's wartime defence industry into a global business. Here's Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko.
Експорт української зброї відкритим. Це рішення, на яке чекали українські зброярі та наші іноземні партнери. Ми запускаємо механізм контрольованого експорту української зброї та оборонних технологій. Головне, кожен контракт працюватиме на нашу ключову мету – сильне оборонне виробництво і більше зброї для українського війська.
Well, hours after the Prime Minister's announcement, Kyiv was hit by another heavy Russian missile and drone barrage. Ukraine is still short of the air defence systems and the ammunition it says it needs to protect its cities and hold the front line. But this is also a country that has built one of the world's fastest-growing defence industries. Our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv has more.
4 out of 28 Russian ballistic and hypersonic missiles. That's how much Ukraine was able to intercept last night. The numbers are a lot worse than in previous attacks. We've had at least 21 fatalities. And you could ask yourself, why is Ukraine opening arms exports now? Surely they need everything they can get at home. When you speak to people in the military here, people who are experts in this field, they support this move for the most part, and this is why. Firstly, Ukraine doesn't produce anything that would stop those ballistic missiles. Ukraine, like the rest of Europe, is wholly dependent on American Patriot interceptors. So opening up exports of Ukrainian interceptor drones, for instance, isn't going to change anything about that. Secondly, it's about the economy. Ukraine's economy is wholly dependent on life support from the EU to pay pensions and keep the military going. And the only private business that really is showing some sign of growth during the war is Miltech. Ukraine's military startups are able to produce tens of billions of euros more in weapons than they're currently doing because the Ukrainian state budget simply doesn't have the funds to buy more from them. By some estimates, it's up to 40 billion euros more a year that could be produced if export were open, and that would generate tax revenue and jobs and help those companies to charge Ukraine less and to recoup their costs from their foreign customers. And thirdly, this is about the future. People here know at what cost that leadership in drones has come, what that's cost the Ukrainian army, and they want those businesses to stay here and create wealth in the future after a peace deal. They don't want to see those companies forced to move abroad or those best specialists, the brightest minds, being poached by foreign arms giants. And that's why they support this move. There are safeguards to make sure that the Ukrainian army gets its weapons first and also to make sure the government earns money. So, as surprising as it might sound, people here are, for the most part, in favour of this move.
Well, Ukraine has also developed long-range strike capabilities and used them to devastating effect deep inside Russia. Ukrainian long-range drones have repeatedly struck Russian oil refineries, fuel depots and pipelines, disrupting supplies and forcing Moscow to defend infrastructure deep inside its own territory. For Kyiv, these attacks are part of a wider effort to weaken Russia's ability to sustain the war. Well, defence expert Nico Lange is a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference. He previously served as Chief of Staff at the German Defence Ministry. Welcome to DW. How significant is this Ukrainian shift from desperately begging allies for weapons to weapons exporter?
Ukraine is not an object. Ukraine is a subject. It made itself a subject by innovating on the battlefield, by producing innovative, not only defensive, but already also offensive weapons. And Ukraine has shown that it can not only defend against the Russian onslaught, it can also create problems for the Russians on the battlefield. And at the same time, Western militaries and militaries around the world, being conservative organizations, have not been at the forefront of innovation. So now everybody is interested in Ukrainian experience, in Ukrainian technology, in Ukrainian knowledge, Ukrainian data, and Ukraine is using this to leverage support for Ukraine.
And help us understand how this makes sense. Ukraine is desperately fighting off a Russian invasion. It needs all the weapons it can get its hands on. But Ukrainians' arms manufacturers say they're producing more weapons than the country can buy. Not more than it needs, but more than it can buy. So are they intending to sell weapons that could actually be used to defend the country?
Ukraine shows what is possible turning the country around in national defense, while in other countries, including in my own country, Germany, you hear a lot of excuses on what is not possible or what is not possible at a certain amount of time. Ukraine shows it cannot produce a single howitzer 4 years ago and now produce more armored howitzers than any European NATO member does, which is, I think, exciting to see that it's possible to do this within a couple of years. Of course, Ukraine is in a different situation than others because it's an existential fight. And I think Ukraine is defending itself in a time where dual-use technologies and the militarization of cheap, commercially available technologies is changing the way warfare is conducted and the economy of warfare.
Okay, let me just interrupt you there because I think you're missing my point. The question I'm really trying to get at is Ukraine intending to sell weapons that they actually need to defend the country?
I think there are two messages in that from Ukraine. One is Ukraine could produce more for itself if there would be more financial possibilities, and it could cover more needs for the battlefield with Ukrainian domestic production. And since the legislation has been changed just recently, there are some types of weapons and subsystems to weapons that Ukraine could export and become part of the global defense and arms market with these innovative products.
Right. So this is surplus to what they need. It's not that there is a need for these weapons, but they think, well, it is better for us to sell them. These are the sorts of weapons that they will not suffer from not using. I just need to be clear on that.
Yes, but you cannot have a general position on this across all categories of weapons. But there are some weapons and some types of ammunition where Ukraine has now the possibility to produce in such high quantities that it can allow itself to export them. And this is exactly the legislation that President Zelensky allowed to pass. So Ukraine can export everything that is accessing the capacity that Ukraine needs to defend itself.
That's exactly
drones.
That's exactly the sort of answer that I was looking for. So, and where would the money go?
Well, Ukraine has enormous financial needs. Ukraine needs to cover the macro financial situation. Ukraine is financing itself by credits from the European Union, and everything that is not loans, everything that is original economic activity will help the Ukrainian government to run the country. So weapons exports, arms exports could become a more important stream of revenues for Ukraine.
And who are the likely customers, do you think?
Well, there are some customers that are maybe likely or that could be likely that still are a little bit arrogant and believe that they have better solutions than the Ukrainians. But we already have seen when push comes to shove around the Gulf, when nobody really had solutions to defend against the Iranian drones, everybody was happily pursuing Ukraine and trying to buy solutions from Ukraine. So I think the Gulf states are already customers. There might be customers that develop products together with Ukraine. So it's not only Ukrainian exports, it's Western companies and Ukrainian companies joint venturing, developing products together. But potentially, Ukraine can be a player on the European defense market, and European militaries, European NATO militaries, will procure Ukrainian products.
Right. We'll come to that. First, are these likely to be sort of conventional financial transactions, or might there be other commodities to be traded for these Ukrainian weapons? Oil, intelligence, political influence?
As we have seen around the Gulf, each and every MOU and then later contract that Ukraine signed with different countries was different. So with some countries, it was for diesel supply, for example. With other countries, it was just purely financial, it was just money. Also, the character of the Ukrainian companies varies. There are some companies that are private companies, but other companies belong to the state-owned armaments complex. So there is no general answer to that.
Right.
There will be different forms of deals and agreements.
European governments, which you've mentioned, trying to build up their own defence industries. Talk to us about the potential for Ukraine to have a role in the European defence industry.
Ukraine can produce more weapons for a lower price at higher speed. This is highly attractive. If I take the example of howitzers that I already mentioned, Ukraine produces now 35, 40 armored howitzers per month. Germany produced around 60 per year when this war started. So it shows how fast Ukraine has ramped up. You have highly qualified personnel in Ukraine. You have very good industries that have experience in machine building, in mass production. You should not forget, Ukraine was the country where the technology and the production for the Soviet space program happened. So Ukraine is very capable at that. And I think some European companies who will discover that they can use Ukraine for scaling up their production will have an advantage over others because they can produce more for a more competitive price.
And is this limited to a particular sector of the defence industry? Because, you know, people watching will think, well, Ukraine's arms manufacturers are operating at surplus capacity 4 years into defending the country against the Russian invasion. And yet we keep hearing that the much bigger and richer United States is worried about its weapons stocks after bombing Iran for only 2 months. So are we comparing like with like?
Depends on what category of weapon and ammunition you look at. I think Ukraine is very successful in scaling up drone production and autonomous vehicles production. The goal in Ukraine is to produce 11 million drones. I think that's far beyond anything that any Western or even globally that any country can produce. So that is an advantage that Ukraine will have and can build on. Ukraine has strengths when it comes to building armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, also the whole maintenance, repair, overhaul part. That is very important to military logistics, is where Ukraine has a strong suit. So this could be areas where Ukraine is very successful. When it comes to other areas, there might be the need to combine Ukrainian production power with Western technologies that are very specific and maybe more advanced than Ukraine in some areas. But I think there are enough opportunities for Ukraine to be successful on the European defense market, and there are great opportunities for Western companies to partner with Ukrainian industry. And Germany, I mean, Germany is not everywhere on the forefront, but the German industry is very good and very well in business already with Ukrainian arms producers.
Thank you so much, Nico Lange from the Munich Security Conference.
Thank you.